I'll never forget the sound of that cheap hotel door clicking shut behind me. Not because it was loud or dramatic or anything you'd see in a movie, but because that sound was the one that split my life cleanly in two. There was before that sound, and there was after. Before, I was a newlywed on her honeymoon in a dreamy seaside town, standing in a white sundress with sand on my toes and a heart so full I thought it might burst. After, I was a woman whose husband was in another room sleeping with a waitress we'd met 3 hours earlier. Even now, I can hear that click. It was small, sharp, the kind of sound you wouldn't think twice about unless your whole world was unraveling right behind it. We'd been married for exactly 2 days. 2. I'd spent a year planning that wedding, down to every petal and every centerpiece. My mother used to tease me that I was so organized, I probably had backup vows tucked in a binder somewhere. She wasn't wrong. I'd been dreaming of that day since I was a kid. You know the type. I was the one making scrapbooks of engagement rings in middle school, cutting out magazine pictures of dresses I could never afford. And then, when I met Ryan, all those daydreams didn't feel so silly anymore. He was charming in that easy, confident way that made everyone in a room notice him. And when he noticed me, I fell hard. He wasn't perfect, but I didn't see the red flags. I saw his ambition, how we talked about building a life together, how he said I made him want to be better. I believed every word because I wanted to. He made me feel chosen, seen, like the years I'd spent wondering if I'd ever find someone who really got me had finally led me somewhere worth being. Our wedding day was beautiful. I mean, truly, I've seen the photos since, and even though they hurt to look at, there's no denying it. Everything glowed. My dad cried when he saw me in my dress. My best friend Jenna caught the bouquet and screamed like she'd won the lottery. Ryan's smile was wide and easy, his hand warm on the small of my back as we danced under fairy lights. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the start of the rest of my life. And for a while, for exactly 48 hours, it was perfect. We flew to this little coastal town, tucked away from everything. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm. Narrow cobblestone streets, the kind of restaurants that smelled like garlic and wine, sunsets that painted the water in gold and orange. We checked into a small boutique hotel, you know, the kind that markets itself as intimate and authentic, meaning the rooms were gorgeous, but the air conditioning barely worked. I didn't care. We were newlyweds. We were supposed to be glowing and flushed, and a little sweaty from the heat and the sex and the wine. The first night, we walked along the beach and laughed about nothing. The second night, we decided to eat at this little seaside restaurant our cab driver had recommended. He said the seafood there was caught fresh that morning. We sat on the terrace, right under a string of lights that swayed in the breeze. I can still smell the salt in the air. That's where she worked, the waitress. Her name was Bella. I didn't know that then, of course. I just remember thinking she looked like the kind of woman who knew exactly how pretty she was, the kind who'd smile just a little too long, let her laugh linger in the air so you'd notice it. Long, wavy hair, tan skin, a smile like she'd been practicing it in the mirror. I'm not saying this with bitterness, not anymore, just clarity. I remember the way Ryan looked at her when she came to take our order. That flicker in his eyes, the tiny smirk. And I remember thinking that's weird, because 2 days earlier, he'd been telling me I was the most beautiful woman in the world. The dinner went fine. She flirted, he flirted back, subtle, but not subtle enough for me to miss it. I let it slide. Maybe that was my first mistake. I didn't want to be that kind of wife. You know, the jealous newlywed who makes a scene because her husband smiled at a waitress. I told myself it was harmless. He was just being friendly. But then he started ordering more drinks. He wasn't a big drinker, or at least I thought he wasn't. But that night, he downed one after another, laughing louder, leaning closer when Bella came by to refill our glasses. I kept trying to steer the conversation back to us, our plans, our next day, the places we wanted to see. But it was like he was drifting further and further away with each drink. When the bill came, Bella slipped a napkin under it. Ryan snatched it up before I could see, grinning like a teenager. My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I just smiled tightly and walked out of that restaurant with a smile that felt glued to my face. Later, when we got back to the hotel, he said he wanted to go grab one more drink at the hotel bar. I said I was tired, that I'd meet him upstairs. He kissed my forehead, told me I'd be right up. He didn't come back. I tried to be patient. An hour passed. Then 2. I texted him, no reply. Called him, straight to voicemail. By the time it hit midnight, I wasn't even angry yet. I was worried. Stupidly, naively, worried. What if he'd gotten lost? What if something had happened? I slipped on my sandals, grabbed the room key, and headed downstairs. The hotel bar was empty, except for a sleepy bartender wiping down glasses. No Ryan. I asked him if he'd seen him. Tall guy, gray button-down, dark hair. The bartender nodded, said he'd left about an hour ago, with someone. Who? I asked. The guy hesitated, then shrugged. That waitress from La Serena, the one who was here earlier. I remember that moment like it's burned into my skin. That rush of cold that starts in your chest and spreads outward until you can't breathe. My ears were ringing. I thanked the bartender, even though my voice cracked halfway through the word, and walked out. The restaurant was a 5-minute walk down the road. I could see it from the corner, lights still on, people laughing on the terrace. I didn't even know what I planned to do. I just walked. Fast, like my body was moving on autopilot and my mind couldn't keep up. When I got there, I saw her first, Bella, standing outside, giggling, one hand on Ryan's arm. They were standing close. Too close. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top, her lipstick smudged just enough for me to notice. He didn't see me right away, but when he did, his face went blank. Like he couldn't compute what I was doing there. I remember saying his name just once, quietly, and that was enough for Bella to take a step back. She mumbled something and disappeared inside. He started stammering, tripping over excuses that made no sense. Like, it's not what it looks like. She just needed someone to walk her back. You're overreacting. I didn't even say anything. I just turned and walked away. He followed me, calling my name, but I didn't stop. Not until I was back in our room, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key card to work. I threw my wedding ring on the bed, sat down on the floor, and stared at the wall. He came in 10 minutes later, reeking of alcohol and guilt. Tried to grab my hands, swear it was nothing. But then his phone buzzed, and there it was. A message from her, "Can't wait to see you again tomorrow, Winky." I remember laughing, like actually laughing out loud, because it was absurd, so humiliating, so painfully ironic that I'd spent months planning a honeymoon only for my husband to turn it into his own personal dating tour. He tried to apologize, begged me not to throw everything away over one mistake. One mistake. That's what he called it. Like I'd spilled a drink on my dress instead of shattering my entire reality. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just said, "Pack your things. We're done." He stared at me like I'd slapped him. "You don't mean that." I said I do. "You can stay with Bella. I'm going home." I booked the first flight out in the morning, called Jenna, and told her everything. She was furious, not just at him, but at me for not burning the whole hotel down on my way out. She remembered saying, "You're handling this way too calmly. You're in shock." Maybe I was. By the time I got home, I'd already emailed a lawyer. Within a week, the papers were signed. He tried calling, texting, showing up at my apartment. I ignored it all. I blocked him on everything. But here's the thing. People always think revenge has to be loud, dramatic, explosive. But sometimes the most powerful revenge starts quiet. It starts with the decision to let someone think they got away with it, to let them relax, to let them believe you're gone and out of their life for good, while you start building something they'll never see coming. And that's exactly what I did. Because Ryan didn't just cheat on me. He lied over and over about who he was, what he wanted, what our life was supposed to be. He made me feel small, made me question my own instincts. And walking away, that wasn't enough. Not for someone like him. He needed to feel it. He needed to lose something, the way I had. So when he reached out again, 6 months later, pretending he'd changed, saying he missed me, saying he just wanted to talk, I didn't delete the message. I smiled, and I started planning. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have moved on and forgotten him? Or would you have done what I did, waited patiently, quietly, and started setting the trap? Because if you've ever been betrayed like that, truly gutted by someone you trusted, then you know forgiveness is overrated. Sometimes, closure looks a lot more like payback. And trust me, mine was coming. I told you I waited. I'm not going to pretend it was easy. Waiting wasn't boredom. It wasn't resignation. It was a quietly furious kind of patience that felt like a second skin. Heavy, deliberate, and impossible to mistake for anything else. I let 6 months slide by on purpose. I let him think I'd been erased from his life. And while he was busy reliving the high of being wanted by whoever would take him, I was rebuilding a version of myself that moved through rooms differently, quieter, smarter, and dangerously well-informed. People expect revenge to be a single blow, some cinematic twist where the villain trips and falls into a conveniently placed pie. But the kind of payback that stings for a lifetime is more like a long negotiation with fate. It's slow work. It's study. It's learning the exact parts of someone that make them feel untouchable, and then going after those parts with surgical calm. First, I cleaned house in my head. I let myself feel everything I hadn't allowed before. The humiliation, the grief, the strange, actual relief. There was relief in knowing the man I'd married in that dress for was not the person I thought he was. But relief is not the same as closure. I wanted him to understand the wreckage he'd left, not just to be hit with a headline and keep walking. I wanted him to lose the thing he prized most, his reputation, the halo he wore into rooms, the narrative he had spun about being this perfect, desirable, moral guy. I wanted people, the colleagues he charmed, the clients he networked with, the friends who stayed loyal because he was such a good guy, to see him in a new light. So I started collecting light, not the invasive, illegal kind. I didn't break into phones or rig emails. I learned his habits. I read his social posts, the comments he left, the dumb, offhand things you say when you're not trying to be careful. I watched who he followed, what bars he liked, whom he bragged about in DMs, to friends, not me, the irony. I found patterns. Men like him leave little footprints. They are consistent in their inconsistency. He'd been brazen with me. He was brazen with everyone. If you look long enough, arrogance shows itself. I also rebuilt my outward life. People underestimate the power of looking like you're fine.
I moved into a small apartment that had light and space. I went back to the career I'd paused during wedding planning, part-time consulting that let me dip into a world of contacts I'd never had before. I started going to events, networking, smiling in a way that said, I am not broken. I wanted him to think I'd evaporated into something smaller, not larger. Men like Ryan underestimate women who look like they're starting over because they assume vulnerability ends at the wound. 2 months in, one of those networking events put me closer to his orbit than I'd planned. He was on the guest list for a charity gala for a client of mine, the kind of event where egos wear tuxedos and people trade favors for applause. I could have sat at home and let it be, but I wanted proximity. I wanted to see how he moved. I wanted to hear him speak in front of people and watch his ego unfurl. That night, he was magnetic. He walked through rooms the same way he had on our wedding day, a practiced, casual swagger, the smile honed for impact. Women noticed him. Men invited him into conversations where he talked about ambition and mentorship and charity work. He talked like a man who did no wrong, like someone who thought morality was a costume you could change depending on the room. When he laughed, people laughed with him. When he told a story, people leaned in. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. Instead, I watched from the other side of the room and started to weave the first real thread of my plan. Public humiliation works better when it comes with undeniable truth. Lies can be yelled down, but truth shouts back. So I needed witnesses. I needed a stage. And I needed to make sure that when the curtain dropped, no one in his world could pretend they hadn't seen what happened. This is where I made my first move, the one that felt almost comedy, and yet was vital. I found Bella. I tracked her down through the restaurant reviews and the little social media trail people leave without thinking. She'd moved towns, maybe to escape him, maybe because he'd moved on. But she had a freelance gig and a vulnerability that made her contactable. When I messaged her, I was direct. I told her who I was, what he'd done, and that I knew she'd been involved. She didn't answer right away. Months of being used make people cautious, but she wrote back eventually, terse and small. And then when I gave her space and didn't demand fireworks, she started telling me things. She was younger than I'd imagined, less practiced in cruelty than Ryan. She'd been flattered by attention and then dumped when it stopped benefiting him. She hated him in that immediate personal way that hurts the most, not because he had cheated, but because he'd made her feel disposable. We met for coffee. I didn't yell. She didn't cry. We traded facts. She told me about the texts, the late-night promises, the talk of open marriages that he used to justify things. She showed me messages that were stupid, arrogant, foolish, not crimes, not necessarily fatal to a career, but humanizing in the worst possible way. He was insecure under the shiny exterior, and that made him predictable. Predictability is a tool. I used it. My plan wasn't to set him up with lies or to lure him into a trap that would put me on legal ground I'd rather not step into. My plan was to let the truth breathe in public. If he had smeared me in polite company, I would smear his image, with facts, with witnesses, with a little drama that pulled at people's sense of fairness. Next, I needed leverage in the right places. That meant people in his professional life who could make noise. I found one in the form of an ex-colleague he'd burned out of vanity, a woman named Claire, who'd been chewed up and spat out after a project Ryan took full credit for. He'd promised her mentorship and then undermined her at every turn. She was still bitter, and she was still well-placed. I planted seeds, gently, the way you loosen soil before you plant bulbs. I didn't say, I want to ruin him. I said, do you remember when he did X? And let her fill in the gaps. People love narratives that confirm what they already suspect about someone they don't trust. They also love being right. By now, you may be asking, isn't this cruel? It is, but cruelty had a price tag on it the night he slept with a waitress while I waited in our room. I had a right to reclaim the narrative of my life, and my tools were social exposure and the law's slow, careful teeth. I consulted a lawyer, not to sue for blood, but to understand how to use the truth without crossing lines. That's important. People will cheer any tale of revenge until it becomes instruction. This was not an instruction manual. It was a deliberate, moral decision to expose harm where harm had been done. I started to build scenes, not fake ones, scenes that used what was true. At the gala where he shined, I made sure Claire was seated in a place where she could hear the right conversations. I made sure Bella and I were in the room, separate, under different names, not to shock him immediately, but to ensure that when the hour came, we could converge like threads into a net. I made friends with the event photographer under the pretext of portfolio work. Small alliances like that open doors you wouldn't expect. The night I decided to move from watching to action, something almost comedy happened. Ryan, being the man he was, had decided to use the gala as a platform for a pitch about integrity in leadership. The irony would have made me laugh if I hadn't been so numb. He gave the speech in that confident cadence, the one he used to make me believe in him, the one I believed for 2 days. And he quoted someone he called a mentor, who had taught him the value of honesty. After his speech, applause filled the room. People crowded around, drinks were raised. He was in his element.
It was the perfect moment, and I almost chickened out. I felt that old tremor of doubt, the one that asks if you're becoming the person you hated in him. Is this petty? Is this necessary? I thought of Jenna's voice in my head. You're in shock. I thought of my mother, who'd always told me to be better than vindication. I almost let the moment pass and told myself I'd take a gentler revenge, the sort that involved a great life instead of a public spectacle. Then I saw Bella at the far end of the room, and for the first time since that night in the restaurant, the outrage settled into the kind of clarity that makes decisions simple. If he wanted to perform morality as a costume, I would pull at the seams in a way that wouldn't break me. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't beg. I would reveal. I did it slowly. I didn't storm the stage. I didn't interrupt his applause. I waited until the post-speech chatter lulled, and then I approached him, from the side where he'd least expect a challenge. He smiled, that trained grin, the one that had fooled me, and shook my hand like we were friendly acquaintances. I let him keep that for a heartbeat longer. Then I said, quietly, "Do you remember me?" Recognition flickered, surprise, then annoyance, then something like calculation. He tried to laugh it off. "Of course, congratulations on the consulting work. You look great." The room, full of people who barely knew me, watched with polite curiosity. "Thank you," I said. "Do you remember 2 nights ago in that seaside town?" Sudden tension. People leaned in, because the air in a room can change, and people are wired to notice. He smiled a different way, nervous now. "I don't follow." I said, "You are very convincing at telling me I was the most beautiful woman in the world." That line landed like a stone in quiet water. He reddened. He attempted to repair it with a half apology that sounded like a salesman hedging a promise. And then, in the most ordinary, controlled move of my plan, I invited Bella to come speak. I didn't call anyone out. I didn't gratuitously humiliate. I simply introduced Bella, this is someone I met in town, and asked, "Would you like to say something about integrity?" I left the question hanging like a dare. She came forward. She was small and fierce and still raw, but she spoke clearly. She didn't shriek or sob. She told 2 simple truths: that Ryan had pursued her while he was married, and that he'd been flippant about it.
She described how he'd used charm like currency. That's all she said. The room shifted. Men glanced at him, women's eyes narrowed. The social equivalent of a shudder passed through the gathered crowd. He tried to laugh it off. He made the classic mistake. He defended himself to strangers in the exact way guilty men often do, by minimizing and charming. The more he explained, the worse he looked. I watched him trying to salvage his image and felt something like cold justice. This was a small cut, nothing that would topple a career overnight. But in a room full of clients, donors, and potential partners, seeds had been planted. Trust once doubted is hard to reclaim. People would start to triangulate. People would talk. And when people start talking, story becomes currency. After the gala, Claire slipped me a note, an email she'd saved for years, where Ryan claimed credit for a project and dismissed a coworker in private. She had names. She had dates. She was willing to whisper to a reporter, if a reporter existed who would listen. I didn't need to go there yet. I kept the note like a card you hide in your sleeve until it's time to play it. There were obstacles, predictable ones. He started to sniff around like a predator sensing the weather change. A week later, I noticed his LinkedIn activity spike. He was posting more, polishing his image. He reached out to mutual friends, sounding wounded and confused. That was always his move, damage control by performance. He would message a dozen people in the same evening with the same careful tone, trying to rebuild a net of sympathizers. Here's the thing about men who think the world owes them sympathy. They expect it. They assume their charm buys them time. That's what let me take the next step. I let him think he still had control. I replied to his messages once, politely, letting him believe I might be open to a conversation. I kept the door ajar, but I didn't step through. I let him straddle that line between hope and reality, because men like him become reckless when they think a wound can still be stitched. That recklessness gave me an opportunity. I arranged a mediated conversation, purely public, in front of a counselor at a small community mediation center. Not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I wanted him to speak on record. He'd been so casual in private that I was curious how he'd present himself where words had consequence. He showed up with a practiced apology, heavy on responsibility language, but thin on actual contrition. He said things like, "I made a mistake," and "I was selfish." They were the phrases men use when they want to keep their options open. Under the guise of closure, I recorded the session, legally, because in our state, one-party consent allows it, and I saved his admission that he'd pursued multiple relationships during the early months of our marriage. Not the kind of panoramic scandal that brings down governments, but a pattern of disrespect. The recording was a tool, not a weapon. I did not post it, not yet. Soon after, his company announced a leadership shakeup. There was talk about new hires, fresh direction, and how Ryan's charisma would be an asset. But people had started to talk about the gala. They'd seen him flinch under simple questions about integrity. A few of his clients pulled back, citing uncertainty and a shift in priorities. Nothing dramatic, but the kind of slow erosion that ruins a man's confidence and deals small professional blows. He was rattled. I felt a private sense of fairness, not triumph. He needed consequences. Whether deserved or not, reputation is part of the world he inhabited. And then he made a mistake that I hadn't counted on. He started asking direct questions about me. I'd been careful, anonymous online as Maya, a soft persona who'd reached him through a mutual group and offered a sympathetic ear. It had been a test. Could I get him to drop his guard in a way that he did only with people he considered safe? He answered messages with the same bravado he used in person, revealing trivial details that, when stitched together, made a map. This gave me a direct line into his life. It made him complacent. Complacency is a deadly thing in men like him. It makes them assume forgiveness or at least indifference. When he started speaking about a possible promotion, about how life was settling back into a comfortable groove, I felt the seat beneath him shift. It was not the sound of victory. It was the soft settling of a trap coming together. But nothing about this plan was tidy. There were nights I lay awake thinking I was losing myself. Was I becoming someone consumed by another person's mistakes? The answer I finally settled on was brutal and honest. Yes, I was consumed, but not by him. I was consumed by reclaiming my power, by reshaping a humiliation into something that taught people a lesson about consequences. Revenge has a moral calculus that's ugly to wrestle with. My sleep suffered. My friends worried. Jenna called me cold more than once. I let her because she didn't have to live inside my choices. The first real test of whether I could go all the way arrived unexpectedly. He invited me to coffee, not because he wanted to reconcile, but because he needed my input on some philanthropic initiative tying into that gala. It smelled like manipulation, but it also smelled like an opening. I accepted, and I recorded the meeting. He came in full charm, apologetic, smiling, and he dropped the kind of casual cruelty that gives you insight into a person's moral scaffolding. He said things about how relationships were complicated and how he'd been exploring options. He spoke of people as amenities, not humans. He tried to make me into a chapter he'd learned from, not the book. When he left, he sent a follow-up email thanking me for being mature and open. He meant it as praise. I saw it as a confirmation. He still believed he was the rare man who could do wrong and still call himself generous. At that point, my plan had 3 main parts. Let truth ripple in his social circles, use documented admissions at key moments, and provide a stage for people he'd wronged to speak where it mattered. I wasn't trying to annihilate him. I wanted him to feel the consequences of the small cruelties he'd made a habit. I wanted his life to reflect the person he'd proven himself to be.
There were close calls. He started sniffing out friends and offering explanations about misunderstandings. He nearly identified Bella as someone I'd recruited. Once, in a text meant to be private, he threatened to expose my bitterness publicly, whatever that meant to him. I panicked for half an hour. Then I took a breath and remembered the lawyering I'd done. I saved the text. I let it sit in a folder where it could stoke a future fire if needed. That's the craft of this work. You don't always strike when you have the power. Sometimes you wait until the pressure vessel is full. By the end of part 2 of this story, the setup phase, he was shaky. Not ruined, but rattled. He'd seen the first rounds of consequence, a client lost, a colleague's quiet whisper becoming louder, and the social theft of a gala applause that had turned to awkwardness. He was looking over his shoulder for reasons he couldn't name, and that was exactly where I wanted him to be. So, what would you have done in my shoes when he texted you, "We need to talk," after a public ripple you set off? Would you have met him alone, or would you have made sure the lights were on and there were witnesses? Be honest, would you have waited this long for payback, or would you have smashed the window the first night? Because the truth about revenge is that the longer you shape it, the sharper it bites, and I was only getting warmed up. By the time I decided to move past tests and little rebellions, I had a folder that felt heavy in my hands, even though it lived on a hard drive. There were screenshots, dated messages, the recorded mediation session, emails to and from clients that hinted at his habit of overpromising and underdelivering, and a pile of notes from people he'd hurt,
Claire's saved documents, Bella's texts, a former intern's diary-like admissions about being appropriated for ideas without credit. The folder was a collage of indignation, not all of it traumatic on its own, but together it made an argument. Truths tiled so that they formed something no spin doctor could easily scrub away. You should know, I never wanted people to get hurt for the sake of spectacle. This wasn't about piling on. It was about aligning consequences with behavior. And for some men, especially the kind who think charisma equals moral immunity, the only language that speaks to them is public accountability in the very place they learn to exploit, their social and professional stage. The first line of my plan was simple: make sure truth met the right ears. The second line was harder: time it so that the revelation would have real teeth. Reputation is like a goldfish bowl. A crack that appears while water is already low will empty the bowl faster. So I picked a season where his company had a big pitch on the horizon, the kind that could boost his profile, and more importantly, his bank of goodwill among clients. Sabotage is a melodramatic word. Call it strategy. If truth comes when someone is at their most exposed, the consequences multiply. The week before that pitch, I did something that felt scarier than anything I'd done so far. I sent an anonymous packet to a small business magazine known for profiles on rising executives, the kind of publication that his clients read. The packet wasn't defamatory. It was surgical, a timeline of events, dated messages, the recorded mediation session, and emails to and from clients that hinted at his habit of overpromising and underdelivering, and a pile of notes from people he'd hurt: Claire's saved documents, Bella's texts, a former intern's diary-like admissions about being appropriated for ideas without credit. The folder was a collage of indignation, not all of it traumatic on its own, but together it made an argument. Truths tiled so that they formed something no spin doctor could easily scrub away. To my surprise, the journalist called. She was careful, the kind of professional who makes you feel like your story is being handled by someone who knows the difference between worth and vendetta. She asked questions that made me think about motive, about nuance. I told her plainly that I wanted him to be accountable. I wanted the narrative around him to include the voices he'd wronged. She asked if she could talk to Claire and Bella. I arranged it. The article didn't out him as a criminal. It never needed to. What it expertly did, was place his behavior inside a pattern. It was an investigative, humane piece where other women described similar experiences. Casual dismissals, promotion hijacks, flirtations that became something more while home life was left to rot. It was the kind of piece that made readers at think pieces pause. Was charisma covering behavior? And because the piece quoted a client as saying the company was reassessing leadership, it set a very particular sort of professional anxiety into motion. When the story hit, Ryan didn't go down like a cartoon villain. He reacted in the way people who've always been given second chances react, by performing contrition and then acting surprised that there were consequences. He posted a statement about growth and learning. He reached out to the reporter with a polished rebuttal. He convened meetings, called clients, and delivered his practiced spiel about transparency. That was the moment I realized I had underestimated something. The power of denial organized well. He was good at gaslighting entire rooms. But there's a difference between a well-executed message and the small, irrefutable truths people remember. He'd made friends and colleagues into witnesses already. He'd left digital breadcrumbs and human fallout. Those things don't go away with pretty words. Then came the breaking point. Not because of one article, but because of a sequence of small collapses that multiplied. A major client postponed their contract renewal the morning his company was scheduled to make the pitch. Another donor withdrew from a charity board where he was an emerging star. Claire's whispers to a former mutual contact turned into a formal complaint past the HR desk at his company, which triggered a quiet internal review. The review wasn't a drumbeat. It was a series of polite emails and terse meetings, but it carried the kind of professional weight that makes executives sweat. A review can be a seed. If it grows, it becomes a root that shifts the whole tree. I wasn't there to watch the branches fall. I was in my apartment watching a different kind of clock, watching him scramble, arranging for his messages to be more carefully scripted, watching him call mutual friends and lay on charm like a varnish, thick and sticky so they wouldn't touch the rot underneath. It was satisfying, sure, but what I remember most is the heavy, turning feeling that revenge isn't always a quick jolt. It's a slow unspooling where you watch someone learn what you already knew. But I didn't stop at consequences in his career. He'd made me feel hollow in a way that touched my finances, my family, and my future. So the third line of my plan was to reclaim not just his reputation, but the narrative of my life. It's easy to forget that cheating often carries costs for the betrayed beyond dignity. There were legal paths. The divorce had already given me a number of legal footholds, but legal recourse isn't always the most satisfying public currency. I wanted him to hear the truths he'd muffled in private, spoken in the public spaces where he built his identity. That's when I made a choice that terrified me. I agreed to a public panel on workplace ethics that was fortuitously being held by the same business magazine. I could have declined. I could have stayed off the stage and let the story be other people's problem, but I wanted to be on the record. Not dramatic spectacle, not a confessional, just truth. The voice of someone who'd been personally harmed by someone who'd been publicly lauded. People warn you about being consumed by vengeance. They say you'll become the thing you hate. They're half right. It consumes you, but not always into a mirror. Sometimes it consumes you into clarity. Standing on that stage, in front of a crowd that had read the piece and had questions, I felt a strange, electric calm. Claire and Bella were there too, not as props, but as witnesses. That was important. Witnesses turn anecdotes into evidence in the currency of social memory. When we spoke, we didn't shout. We told facts. We named dates. We described behaviors. We let the silences between sentences do part of the work. After the panel, the reaction was immediate. Colleagues texted me with surprise and empathy. A few old friends who'd been on the fence reached out to say they were sorry. The reporter asked for more documents. The magazine ran a follow-up piece with a deeper dive into his company's culture. The internal review accelerated. The review found inconsistencies in how projects had been credited and questioned practices that put junior staff at a disadvantage. The board issued a statement saying they were committed to upholding professional standards and that they would be conducting their own inquiry.
Here's the thing. Men like Ryan are built on momentum. They assume charm will forever supply credit. Once that momentum slows, small things gain disproportionate power. A single postponed contract can tip budgets. A donor pulled at the wrong time can lead to restructuring. Suddenly, friends become risk assessments. And once people move from defending to distancing, the social scaffolding begins to waver. 1 week after the panel, his company announced a leadership shuffle. He was stepping back from client-facing duties. He was given a title with less visibility. The press phrased it in the neutral language of corporate change, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't a firing. It was a social recalibration that left him with less of the thing he loved most, the public stage. If you're wondering whether that was the catharsis I wanted, the answer is complicated. It felt like a triumph and a funeral at the same time. It felt like a building finally admitting the foundation had been poorly laid. But I learned something important in those weeks. Victory often brings grief. You grieve the person you once believed in and the life you imagined. That grief doesn't disappear because there's a headline. It sits with you like an honest thing. And then came the first major payoff.
The moment where the chessboard tilted in a way that couldn't be easily rewritten. It wasn't a viral scandal. It wasn't a criminal charge. It was a slow, precise thing. A major client, the one whose contract would have meant an expansion, publicly cited the company's misalignment with evolving ethical standards as the reason for pausing negotiations. The pause became an audit. The audit unearthed a pattern of misattributed work. That led to a review of promotions. That led to a board discussion. And when a board faces legal risk, it acts to protect itself. The result was an announcement that left his name less attached to the public-facing leadership pipeline than it had been a month before. There was a day in which his once routine LinkedIn posts, the ones where he polished personal brand aphorisms about integrity, started to look like relics. People bookmarked them, then commented politely, then slowly unfriended. The small digital deaths hurt in the same way door slams do. They aren't loud, they are nevertheless absolute. Some will call that small-minded. Some will call it precise. I call it proportional. He had taken from me the faith that people often give blindly to the person they love. He had taken from Bella a sense of worth. He had taken from Claire opportunities. The consequences I engineered were not cruel punishments. They were recalibrations of the world to fit the truth. People like him rarely see that kind of mirror placed in front of them, one that reflects their behavior in unvarnished daylight. But the story isn't neat. There were costs. There were nights I lay awake thinking of the man who had once whispered promises in my ear and wondering whether the damage I'd done was more than rebalancing, whether it was a personal cruelty that would haunt me. There were friends who said we should have handled it quietly. There were moments of genuine sorrow for a life that had ended, not because of one event, but because of years of patterns I'd only just begun to map. Then came the close call that nearly unraveled everything. A mutual friend confronted me, angry and loud, and convinced I'd gone too far. He accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign. He said I'd weaponized truth for revenge. That was a moment where the narrative could have turned. I could have been painted as the villain, the ex-wife on a mission. It's a thin line. People love stories with heroes and villains because they fit comfortable plots. The more complicated arc, where truth and vengeance overlap, is harder to sell. So I did something counterintuitive. I met with him, the mutual friend, face to face, not to argue, but to explain. I told him about the small cruelties that added up, about the nights I cried on my bathroom floor, about every time Ryan made me feel like I'd misplaced my sense of reality. I told him why I'd waited, why I'd timed things, why I'd chosen witnesses instead of theatrics. I asked him to look at the folder, not at me. People respond to evidence if you let them. He listened. He left quieter than he came. A week later, he told 2 others what he'd seen. The ripple widened. That's the thing about careful plans. They're not bulletproof, but they create opportunities for truth to be acknowledged by people who matter. The payoff wasn't a single explosion. It was a succession of small collapses, each one rearranging pieces of a life I no longer wanted to inhabit. By the time the board asked him to step away from certain responsibilities, by the time clients started to look elsewhere, by the time his name was attached to cautionary tales instead of meteoric ones, I felt a slow settling. It wasn't glee. It was an exhausted clearing of the air. And yet, even then, the revenge felt incomplete in a personal way. He'd lost stage time and clients, but he hadn't lost his family background, his charm, his ability to move on perhaps to someone else who didn't know the pattern. That, oddly, was something I had to reconcile with. You can't control the entire arc of a human life. You can only change the way they move through certain hallways. The moral of that is double-edged. Yes, people who cause harm should be held accountable, but also the world is messy and justice is often partial. At the end of part 3, the landscape had changed. He felt the consequences in his career, in his social currency. I had helped orchestrate that shift without violating myself, mostly staying on the correct side of law and ethics. It was a fragile victory, significant, but not total. I had my life back in many ways. A consulting contract I'd taken that month, a friend group that had rallied, and a growing sense that I could stand in a room and not dissolve when my name came up. I was still human. The wound healed unevenly. Some days were harder than others. Some nights I still replayed the click of that hotel door. But I asked myself often during those long, tense weeks, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have let the slow burn be your agent, or would you have wanted immediate, glorious retribution? Be honest with me. Would you have been able to walk away from that first moment and choose to make consequences fit the harm, to make sure it was not just spectacle, but meaningful accountability? I don't judge your answer. I only offer mine. I chose proportionality. I chose a strategy that respected truth and used witnesses rather than lies. I chose to make him feel what his actions cost him in the currency he cared most about. And that choice led to real change. Not total redemption, not total destruction, just a rebalancing that left him quieter, less sure, and more guarded, which, for a man who traded on certainty, was a kind of punishment. The next weeks felt like walking through a gallery where every painting was a memory of what I'd lost, but now the frames were turned outward and strangers could see the brushstrokes. The campaign I'd set in motion didn't explode into flame the way movies promise. It smoldered and then predictably caught where oxygen met tinder. I'd expected resistance. I hadn't expected how ugly his resistance would be or how vindictive it would make him sound when he thought no one was listening. He tried to strike back. Of course he did. Men like him do not bow quietly. They manufacture storms. At first it was performative. Polished posts about personal growth, vague statements about false narratives, a passive-aggressive blog post about how trust is complicated. He hired a consultant, the kind who sterilizes reputations, and he tried to paint the whole thing as an overblown misunderstanding. He started whispering in ears, the same old network of favors and smiles. He sent a terse email to a couple of clients, a message soaked in wounded dignity, trying to rally the people who'd once championed him. But I had something he hadn't planned on. Corroboration that wasn't theatrical. I had evidence and witnesses who were willing to speak plainly. I had Bella's messages, Claire's documents, recordings where his own voice made the case for pattern over anomaly. And when he moved from charm to litigation threats, a predictable escalation, I had a lawyer who had been quietly building a file on fairness and professional responsibility. Threats only sound powerful when they have no consequences. When you can say calmly,
That's fine. Take the route you choose. With a lawyer who knows how to parry, the thunder passes over and moves on. He made a mistake that would prove decisive. He panicked and leaked something petty and personal to a mutual friend, a private email about me, thin with accusation, heavy with projection. He meant to stain me. Instead, the friend, who'd always had a spark of ethics, took it to another mutual contact, someone who still worked inside his company. That person, tired of the constant moral calculus and the fear of being the next one left out,
forwarded our folder, not to smear, but to say, we need to look at what's happening here. Sometimes the weakest link in a network is the one with a conscience. The internal review turned into a deeper probe. It wasn't dramatic, no midnight raids or handcuffs, but it was thorough in the corporate way that matters. Audits, interviews, a slow legalistic reading of projects and credits. As the probe widened, small things began to appear in a different light. Timelines that didn't line up with his claims. Credit given where credit was due, but to others. Patterns of mentorship promised and mentorship withheld. What he had considered trivial or defensible started to look like a culture that allowed him to overreach. And then came the day that felt like thunder after months of rain. The board convened a public town hall with staff and clients, ostensibly to reassure people and to get ahead of rumors. He assumed the room would be his. The crowd would nod, they'd rally, they'd accept his narrative of being a victim of gossip. He practiced, he polished, he memorized notes about humility and accountability. He smiled like a man used to winning rooms. What he didn't count on was that 3 people would stand up during questions and speak so plainly that the room could not unhear them. Claire stood first, professional, precise, a woman who had been near him in the trenches when projects were won and credit was stolen. She described, without melodrama, the facts, dates, emails, meetings where contributions weren't acknowledged. People listened not to the hurt itself, which was real, but to the evidence that made the hurt meaningful. Bella stood next. She didn't dramatize, she didn't demand vengeance. She told the room about being pursued, about the confusion of being wanted in one room and discarded in another. Her voice trembled on the edges, and that tremble made the room uncomfortable in a truthful way. It wasn't revenge, it was testimony. I sat at the back. I felt cold, which is the oddest way to feel in a crowded room. You expect anger, you expect adrenaline, but mostly I felt a sort of exhausted gravity. I'd rehearsed what I would say if called upon, but I didn't speak. I let the facts land. After the public testimony, the air changed. His smile faltered. He tried to talk over the evidence with charm and with the practiced language of contrition, but people heard the pattern. In a world of small, quiet corruptions, patterns are how truth finds a megaphone. The board released a statement that night about structural concerns and the importance of equitable attribution, and his role was, in corporate language, reassigned pending further review. Reassigned, a bureaucratic word that felt like exile. There was a kind of professional death rattle in the weeks that followed. Clients who'd once sought him out began scheduling time with other team members. Mentors who'd once recommended him, privately, made fewer introductions. Invitations to panels dried up. The thing he fed on most, the bright, warm validation of an audience, thinned to a trickle. People don't always lose jobs in scenes. Sometimes they lose the communal oxygen that made their personas combustible. He lashed out in private, which hurt in a different way. Privately, he tried to intimidate me, to paint me as the architect of a smear campaign. He left bitter voicemails that made him sound furious and small. He showed up at an industry dinner one night uninvited, and when I walked in with a colleague who knew the truth, he watched me with something like hunger for the narrative to revert to him. It didn't. The room's energy kept him at a distance. People had seen the town hall. The ripples after a stone are longer than the splash. There was, however, a moment I hadn't anticipated. Pity. Not for him exactly, but for how vastly unmoored his moral compass was. At a certain point, he stopped being a character who was merely arrogant and became a man who had been given a mirror and refused to look, so he flailed. There's a cruelty in watching a person resist their own reflection, an exhausted pity that doesn't excuse the harm but recognizes the human wreckage beneath the bluster. The real turning point was not the public humiliation, it was the private admissions that came after. In separate calls, a junior associate he'd sidelined and an intern he'd belittled both sent me messages not because they wanted revenge, but because they wanted to see fairness. They offered corroborations, a pattern of small cruelty stitched across years. Those messages landed like final bricks in the slow construction of consequence. The board could no longer plausibly claim ignorance. It acted to protect the company. He was eased out of certain leadership roles. He wasn't fired, not in the dramatic sense, but the stage he loved was taken from him. He retained a title for payroll purposes, the kind of corporate mercy that leaves a person alive and quieted. There are nights I replay that period and wonder if I was cruel. There are nights I remember the way he'd stood at our bedside and promised me the world, and I feel a cold that isn't satisfaction and isn't relief. It's the absence of what should have been. But revenge, as I learned, is never a clean ledger. You don't get complete currency back. You get a rebalancing that satisfies in some ways and aches in others. The climax of everything came not in a courtroom or a public spectacle, but in a small, almost painfully human moment. We ran into each other in the lobby of a museum a year after the gala, months after the reassignment. He was with someone new, someone who smiled like they hadn't read the articles. He looked smaller to me, not because he'd lost clients, but because the armor had been chiseled away. He tried to offer a handshake that felt like a truce. I could have refused. I could have walked past with a performative scowl. Instead, I took his hand, briefly, and said softly, "Do better." He looked at me then in a way that wasn't pleading. It was recognition. He understood, perhaps for the first time fully, that the person in front of him was once someone who had trusted him. I don't think he regretted everything. Regret is a complicated thing. But he did at that moment look like a man who had felt consequence. What surprised me was how little vengeance tasted like triumph when confronted with another human being's smallness. The moment didn't absolve him. It didn't erase the late-night humiliation, or the planning, or the long, careful weeks of rebuilding, but it offered a human punctuation, an acknowledgement that no matter how carefully you engineer someone's fall, the outcome is still two people living in the same world. You still have to live with what you've done. After that, life settled into a new rhythm. The public part of my campaign faded. The magazine's follow-up pieces dwindled. My life, which had been partly organized around strategy, quietly rearranged itself. I returned to work fully. I signed a contract for a consulting engagement that gave me financial relief and professional pride. I reconnected with friends who had stayed, and I built a life that had room in it for both joy and sensible caution. People asked me predictably whether I felt vindicated. "Do you feel better?" they asked, as if emotion is a simple meter you can read after something happens. The honest answer is messy. I felt relief, a solid domestic kind that arrived in small practical ways, like sleeping through the night and not flinching when the phone rang. I felt sorrow for the life I had imagined and the person I'd loved, and I felt something else, a careful, guarded hope. Time did its work. I dated, I hesitated, I learned boundaries anew. And then, slowly, a new relationship surfaced, not because I was trying to replace what had been stolen, but because I found someone who saw me and whose small, consistent acts of care added up in ways that felt like healing. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't try to own my story. He listened. He asked questions. He let me have space to be angry without turning it into a problem for him. Sometimes the real revenge is living a life that makes the people who hurt you seem smaller by contrast. I think about the night he cheated sometimes, not with the jagged, overwrought anger I had at first, but like someone who visits an old scar. You can trace it with your fingers and remember it, but it doesn't prevent you from moving. The click of that hotel door still echoes now and then, but it echoes in a room I furnished on my terms.
Be honest with me. Would you have done the same thing? Would you have assembled witnesses and waited for a season of consequence, or would you have wanted immediate retribution? I don't ask to judge. I ask because that question reveals what revenge means to different people. For me, it wasn't about hurting him beyond reason. It was about making him feel the weight of choices in a space he valued. It was about proving, first to myself, that I could reclaim narrative and dignity without becoming something I regretted. The cost was quieter than I thought it would be. There were friendships that frayed. There were nights I questioned the ethics of what I'd done. There was a loneliness in the precision of the plan, a solitude you don't choose when you're the one doing the work. But there was also a kind of justice that felt proportional. He was not destroyed. He was not crowned either. He was, in the essential way that mattered to him, diminished from center stage to a quieter role. That was enough. Years later, when I think of the honeymoon, I don't only see pain. I see a pivot point, the raw place where a life split, and then, by stubborn work and careful choices, reassembled into something fuller. I found love again, yes, and I found a career that made me proud. I found boundaries I hadn't known how to articulate before. And I found that revenge, when tempered with truth and mercy, can be a strange teacher. It shows you who you are when confronted with someone who has wronged you. And it gives you the chance to choose the person you want to become afterward. If you're sitting with a wound and picturing yourself in my shoes, know this: the path you choose will define you more than the act that hurt you. Patience can be power, but so can walking away. There's no one right way to answer a betrayal. For me, the long, cinematic plan I built in the quiet hours felt like the justice I needed. It didn't make the past disappear. It gave me a mirror where truth sat on one side and consequence on the other. So what would you have done? Would you have waited and plotted? Or would you have walked away and never looked back? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? Whatever your answer, remember this: closure is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet, steady work of living a better life after the click of a door you never expected to hear.